Good evening, everyone. My name is Gary Ginsberg, and I'm honored to help kick things off tonight. It's great to see so many people here joining us for this exciting event. First, I want to thank the Jewish Federation of Northeastern New York for organizing this virtual program. And I'd like to recognize the generous members of the Brandeis Baruch, Chaim Weitzman, and Maimonides Societies, whose support helps ensure we get informative speakers like Ira Rosen to come and give us a behind-the-scene look at 60 Minutes. Programs like this are just one of the many terrific ways JFED serves our community and helps provide spiritual and intellectual nourishment to members of the greater Capital Region's Jewish community. And while we are meeting virtually this evening, I think it's fair to say that when we can again safely meet in person, we can expect the Jewish Federation to include a more tangible, perhaps even brisket-based nourishment to events like this. This evening, we are fortunate to have the accomplished and award-winning producer and author Ira Rosen with us to discuss his book, Ticking Clock, Behind the Scenes at 60 Minutes, and his time at the iconic news program. Among the many awards and recognitions Mr. Rosen has earned for his incredible work are 24 Emmys, 6 Investigative Reporters and Editors Awards, 4 DuPont Awards, 2 RFK Awards, 2 Peabody Awards, 2 Sigma Delta Chi Awards, a Murrow Award, and the Hillman Prize. Like I said, a very accomplished and award-winning producer. Federation will be raffling off 3 copies of Mr. Rosen's book this evening, and we will announce the winners at the start of the Q&A later on. If you are not one of the lucky winners, you'll be able to purchase the book through JFED by contacting Linda Paula Kessler and supporting our Friends of the Federation, the Book House of Stuyvesant Plaza. If you would like to ask Mr. Rosen a question, please type it in the chat box during the presentation. With that, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Mr. Ira Rosen.
Gary, thank you so much. That was very kind introduction. And I also want to thank everybody for showing up tonight instead of watching 60 Minutes. Sometimes it's more fun to see how the sausage is made, I guess, than actually eating it. So tonight I'll give you a little bit of an insight into that. For 53 years, 60 Minutes has been on television, and it was the show that most Americans relied on to stay informed. And its willingness to challenge authority impacted the public consciousness. It invented TV investigative journalism, including the use of hidden cameras and confrontational interviews to tell its stories. Today, there is a dilution of news with thousands of potential news sources. But when 60 Minutes was in its heyday, it was the only news magazine that was on TV, and it had a viewership that each week rivaled that of the Super Bowl. And that reach gave producers like myself enormous powers. We were able to sort of use that audience to get stories for us. And it also, the reach convinced whistleblowers, con men, even mob bosses to tell their stories on the show. And we were able to get the wrongfully convicted out of jail. We exposed farm workers, VA hospitals, crooked congressmen, and doctors that were adept at ripping off insurance. And that sort of made the producers on the show feel like Superman with the superpowers the show gave us. And people ask a lot, what does a producer do? And a producer on 60 Minutes finds the story, researches the story, convinces people to go on camera, edits the story, writes the questions for it, and ultimately takes responsibility if it doesn't go right. But it's not that the correspondents are not capable of doing it. They're often doing 25 different stories in the course of a year, and a producer would only do maybe 4 or 5 stories. And so that gives us a lot more ability to research it and to put stories together. I wasn't born a 60 Minutes producer. I was sort of working in the Catskills, which I'm sure everyone on this call remembers. I was a tennis pro there at the Homowack Lodge. I was a busboy and a waiter at the Windsor, the Nemerson. And what it did was, at night, if you're working in the Catskills, you had to work the nightclub lights. And I was working the nightclub lights at the time for some of the comedians who would go up to the Catskills, Red Buttons, Jan Murray, Alan King, and of course, Henny Youngman. And Henny Youngman tells the famous joke, "Take my wife, please," or "I'm going to take my wife to a place she's never been before, the kitchen." Now, if you notice, that story and that joke has a beginning, middle, and end. It has an impact, all told in a few short words. Well, I learned the art of storytelling from the Catskill comedians. And they taught me, to be direct, to be concise, to be emotional. And when I got to 60 Minutes, the trick of 60 Minutes, tonight I'm going to tell you what that trick is. The trick is, tell me a story. That's what Don Hewitt had always said, tell me a story. And what I'd like to do is just read a few graphs from my first chapter, which is chapter 1, called The Phone Call. And it's really about not so much me, but about my Jewish mother. And this is what happened in 1980 when Don Hewitt called. My path to 60 Minutes began on June 1980 when the phone rang at my parents' home in Fresh Meadows, Queens. "Is this the home of Ira Rosen?" the caller inquired. "Yes, who are you?" my mother replied. "I'm Don Hewitt, executive producer of 60 Minutes. "Oh, yes, I've read about you," my mother replied. "You have a lovely wife." "Thank you. What are you doing?" "I'm making a kugel," my mother said. "A kugel? God, I haven't had a good kugel in a long time," Hewitt said. "You come visit me and I'll give you a kugel," my mother offered. My mother, Ethel, was the quintessential Jewish mother, nagging, judgmental, someone with all the answers. "Actually, I'm looking for Ira," Hewitt said. "I'd like to see if he'd be interested in being a producer for 60 Minutes. "Oh, he's not interested. He's got a good job," my mother said. "Thanks anyway." I listened from across the room to the conversation, and I asked my mother who was on the phone. "Don Hewitt of 60 Minutes. He wanted to offer you a job, but I told him you already had one," she said. "How many jobs do you need?" I leapt from the chair and raced to the phone to call Hewitt back. Even though a few minutes had passed, he immediately picked up the phone. He was laughing. "I don't know about you, but I like your mother. If you don't want the job, tell her it's hers." I, of course, wanted the job. And so, by the way, later, when I did get the job, my mother would make a kugel for Don Hewitt, which anybody who buys the book tonight, contact Linda, and I'm going to send Linda the secret recipe, my mother's secret kugel recipe for all verified buyers of the book. And by the way, I've put together already an incredible email list of kugel lovers from around the country. So it's one hell of a recipe. As they asked me in Jacksonville, is it savory or is it parva? It has chicken fat in it, so just be forewarned. Anyway, on this particular day, I went in to see Hewitt, and Hewitt was full of life. He was joking and telling stories, but he wanted me to be interviewed by the person who I'd end up working with, which was going to be Mike Wallace. And Mike Wallace was, at the time, the #1 correspondent for the #1 show in the country. He was kind of the tough guy. He was the one who had asked all those aggressive questions. He was the one who people feared, and they were the one who the show's reputation was built around. He was the one who created the image of 60 Minutes in many ways. And when I went to see Mike on that particular day, he looked at my resume and was completely unimpressed. I was 26 years old. I had 6 months of TV experience. And he said, "That's not very much to be a producer on 60 Minutes. And he was totally right. And so I looked in a corner of the office and I noticed he had a tennis ball. And I said, "You play tennis?" And he said, "What's it to you?" And I said, "Well, I was on the Cornell tennis team." And he would tell me later that clinched the job for me, because if I didn't work out as a producer, he figured he could get 6 months of tennis out of me before firing me. So at the end of that particular day, I was hired. And I was so excited because I had been bouncing around from newspaper job to newspaper job. And suddenly I'm being offered the job to be Mike Wallace's producer on 60 Minutes. Imagine that. And here's what happened when I called my mom to tell her. I walked out of the office dazed. I'd come from covering high school sports in Fresno, California, to becoming Mike Wallace's producer on the hottest show on TV. Not only was Mike the star, but I'd become the youngest producer they had ever hired. I called my mother to tell her, Mom, I was just hired to be Mike Wallace's producer on 60 Minutes. Without missing a beat, my mom said, Mike Wallace, he's so old. Why can't you work for Dan Rather? Anyway, can never make her happy, I guess. But she did begin to see some of the stories that I did and produced. And I think my mother's favorite story is the one involving the one that got away, which was Marlon Brando. Now, Marlon Brando at the time was probably one of the world's most famous actors and also one of the world's biggest recluses. And he didn't do interviews. And I had just completed a story on a gangster, Joe Bonanno, and I wanted to use a little bit of The Godfather. And I called up Paramount Studios and they said, okay. But then suddenly Brando called me and he wanted to know if it was okay to use and all that stuff. And he and I began a long, months-long conversations over the phone. And Brando would call me up in Yiddish and start talking to me in Yiddish because his teacher was Stella Adler, the great acting coach. And she would always talk Yiddish to him. So he'd call me up, "Was machst du?" and Gunish. And we would have conversations in a little bit in Yiddish. And then we would just start talking. And he called me up one day and he said, you ever know that these people who have these great reputations are real a-holes? And I said, Marlon, what are you talking about? And he said, Charlie Chaplin, great reputation, not a nice guy. William Saroyan, great reputation, the writer, not a nice guy. Anyway, those would be the conversations that he and I would have. But the thrill of those conversations with Brando would be reading me Saroyan. And was really incredibly hypnotic. And so he finally agreed to get a dinner with Mike Wallace and I, and he picked us up at the Beverly Hills Hotel when we were out in LA. And he picks us up in a white Rolls Royce, and he's wearing a white suit. And Mike gets into the front and Mike says to him, I'm a little nervous. And Brando says, I am too. And I'm saying, yes, this is going so well. And Brando starts driving down Mulholland Drive and he's running every single red light. And I said, Marlon, what are you doing? And he said, you're going to let a machine tell you what to do? Be a man. And I said, oh boy, this is going to be touch and go if we get to this restaurant. But somehow we got to the restaurant and we sit down and Brando starts. Mike, you're an amazing actor. I'm not an actor, I'm a journalist. Oh, stop it. The way you raise your eyebrow, take your glasses off, that fake look you give sometimes, it's brilliant. You would have won an Academy Award. And so Mike decides to sort of try to ignore the comment. And so he says, how did you get so fat? And Brando was fairly chunky. And he says, well, I go to Baskin & Robbins and I can't decide what flavor ice cream I want. So I go and I end up ordering a quart of everything they have and I bring it home and I end up eating it all. At which point Mike says, I'm 66 years old. I don't need to show America what a jerk you are. Why don't we just be friends? And Brando grabs his hand and shakes it. And I, of course, am livid because it took months to get this moment. And basically Mike tells him, he would make him look bad. So I never quite understood why Mike did it. It was probably a mix of ego and also fear that Brando may get one up on him. I'm not quite sure, but Brando and I really didn't have any conversations after that, except for one more phone call. And he calls me up and he said, you play the stock market? And I say a little bit, I don't have much money. He said, well, let me give you a tip. What's that? It's a company called Apple. I never heard of it. You will, trust me. So I tell Wallace about the conversation and he said, are you going to buy the company stock? I said, are you crazy? Why would I take a tip from a guy who can't decide what flavor ice cream he wants? Anyway, that's another one that got away. But one that didn't get away was the interview we did with Andrei Sakharov, the great Soviet dissident. And we were doing a story about Edward Teller, the creator of the US H-bomb. And Teller insisted that we interview Sakharov. And you have to remember at that time, 60 Minutes had this unlimited budget. We were not considered, as become the nomenclature of our times, fake news. we were able to go anywhere to research a story and literally take as much time as we want to put a story together. So I went to the airport, I flew to Moscow, and I got there, and the CBS bureau chief in Moscow set me up with Sakharov, and Wallace joins me a couple days later. And we go to pick up Sakharov at his flat in Moscow. And it was really quite a remarkable scene because all the Soviet Jewish dissidents were in his little apartment. They were drinking tea, having cookies, talking about immigrating to Israel. And it was really, in many ways, the start of what would eventually lead to the great, shortly thereafter, the great migration of many Jews who left to go to Israel. But it really was beginning in that apartment. It was crystallizing in that apartment. It was incredible to see just a short vision of that. So we go to knock on the door, and Elena Bonner, his wife, answers the door, and she says, "You make sure you bring him back by 3 o'clock." And Wallace says, "Yes, Mrs. Bonner." And we go off with Sakharov, and we go to the CBS bureau, and we start doing questions with him. And we ask him about the Rosenbergs, who obviously were convicted of selling secrets to Russia, the nuclear secrets. And he said, "We didn't get anything of value from them. What we used to do was we used to go out in the Pacific Ocean after these US nuclear tests in the Pacific Ocean, and we'd go out into Siberia and wait for the fallout to come. And we would go into the snows and gather the fallout and then deconstruct the fallout. And that's how we figured out the components of the US bomb." It was really quite a remarkable interview. And we go back to the US, and now it's Edward Teller's turn. But Teller had just written a book, and he said, "I'm only going to talk about what's in the book." And this is where a producer earns his money or her money. And what I figured out was if Wallace was going to ask him a question that didn't come from the book he had just written, he's going to walk off camera and he's going to leave, and we're going to be stuck maybe with an incomplete story. So what I did was I had the cameraman thread the microphone through his shirt, and then using thumbtacks, we thumbtacked him into the chair. And he was unaware of it because we were talking to him and distracting him. And sure enough, Wallace asked the question that he didn't like. And he says, "I think we're done right now." And he starts moving to his shirt, trying to remove the microphone. And it was remarkable to see. Here's a guy who invented the US H-bomb, who couldn't figure out how to take the microphone off his shirt without ripping it. And so he's trying, and Wallace is saying, "No, Dr. Teller, let me try another question. Let me try again." And this went on for about 2 minutes. Steve Croft would later say it was the greatest almost walk-off he had ever seen in the history of TV. Teller sat in that chair, didn't leave, finished the interview. We bring it back to New York. And I get into the stories a little bit, and I don't have time to get into all of the stories of this. But in the book, I talk a little bit about what it was like to really work with Mike Wallace. And aside from the way he sometimes treated his subjects on camera, well, multiply that by a factor of 2 or 3 to the producers who used to work with him. He was really, really a kind of a real tough guy. And one producer had developed ulcers that he nicknamed Myron, which was Mike's real name. And all the producers who worked with him had various medical conditions. I had a bad back, and I would lay on the floors to make phone calls. And by the way, if you walk down the hallways, you would see a lot of producers laying on the floor because their backs were bad. And that's sort of the tension that the job really created. But anyway, we go back, we put the Edward Teller story together, but Mike was in a mood. He wanted to sabotage his own story to make me look bad. I had been working with him for about 8 years, and so he felt, now's time to trade me in for a newer model, even though I was only 34 years old. And so he took out all of the Sakharov stuff, and he took out the walk-off by Edward Teller, and we screened it for you, and he says, "Nice try, kid." And I said, "Can I show you a different version tomorrow?" He said, "Absolutely." So I show him a different version tomorrow. And sure enough, he said, "I've never seen this before. You took a 2.2 and made it into a 9.9. And Wallace was livid because it was his chance to sort of try to put a knife in me, which he was, trying to do. I didn't know what was going on inside his head at the time. And what was going on inside Mike's head was he was suffering from severe bouts of depression. And later on, he would go public with his depression and talk about it. And in many ways, of all the stories he didn't produce as much change and help people as much as by going public with his own depression and talking about getting the right medication to feel better. And that really helped a lot of people. But at the time, he was not being medicated. He was covering up his depression. And he was really a tough guy to work with. And so after we screened the story, I realized that I needed to move on. And Diane Sawyer was creating a new program at ABC called Primetime Live. And she asked me to be one of the managers of the program and help develop it. And so I ended up leaving Mike and going to work with Diane. End of story with the Teller thing, it ended up winning an Emmy for the best interview that year. And when I called Mike to tell him from the award ceremony, he basically cursed me out and hung up the phone. So it was time to leave. But the true wonderful irony that I talk about in Ticking Clock is that I was leaving Mike to become boss of Chris Wallace, his son. And the thing about Chris, and people who I'm sure have seen him on presidential debates and on Fox, is he never once asked me, what would my father do? He always wanted to carve out his own kind of path. He had a relationship, kind of a very strained relationship with his dad. His dad had divorced his mom when Chris was very young, and he considered that his stepdad, who would later become president of CBS, Bill Leonard, was his real dad. And so Mike had always this tension with Chris. And it never became more apparent than when Chris Wallace at Primetime Live was trying to do a profile of the comedian Chris Rock. And Chris had normally done a lot of investigative stories, but he was really excited about doing Chris Rock. So he was preparing the thing, and then he calls me up and he said, "You're not going to believe it. My father just stole the story from me." I said, "I don't believe that." No, there's no way. So I called up Mike. And when we talked, there's no hello, how are you? Are you having a good day? No, you just start talking. And that was kind of the rhythm of phone calls at that time. So Mike answers the phone and I said, "Are you doing Chris Rock?" And he said, "What's it to you?" And I said, "Well, your son had booked it and you're ripping him off." He said, "He'll get over it." I said, "Mike, you have a choice. Either you could have Chris speak at your funeral or you could do Chris Rock. You can't have both." Pause. Let me get back to you. And so he hangs up. He calls me up about 10 minutes later and he said, "I solved the problem." I said, "How did you solve the problem?" He said, "I gave the story to Ed Bradley." I said, "Mike, how is that solving the problem? You're still ripping your kid off." He said, "Oh, what are you talking about? I'm not doing it." Anyway, they didn't talk for 6 or 8 months after that period of time. And that gives you a sense also of what kind of competition existed amongst the correspondents. If the competition exists like that with father and son, imagine what it's like when you're in the hallways. And Mike Wallace's office was about this far from Morley Safer's office, this far. Yet Mike would go out of his way, and back then, a lot of the stories came from the New York Times. So Morley would get up at about 4 in the morning to read the first edition of the Times. And if he saw a good story in it, he would what's known as blue sheet it, which is like a quick claim deed on the story. Mike, on the other hand, was very close to the editor of the New York Times, Abe Rosenthal. And so he would have Abe Rosenthal send him the copy of the Times the night before. So Mike would get a jump on Morley. But when those things didn't work out, Mike would simply send his producers out to rip off Morley. And so when that happened, the two of them wouldn't talk. And so they had these intense rivalries that existed. And when we were producing 60 Minutes at that period of time, the reason it became, in many ways, such an addictive program was because we were doing stories that today you're not going to see much anymore. They were stories that had two different points of view. One of my favorite stories at the time was a story called Driving While Old. And what goes on in Florida, for example, is a lot of people get old and they shouldn't be driving, but the judge, when the court case comes before him, don't have the heart to take away their driver's license. So what they do is they keep their driver's license and they're able to go to the supermarket and see friends and visit with people. But on the other hand, they might also be endangering other people on the road. So it's that kind of tug of war that was what made 60 Minutes such a terrific program. And also another story which they did back then was Not in My Neighborhood. And that was about group homes that are placed in suburbia, for example. And a lot of liberals would say, yes, I believe in group homes and they should, people in these homes should be mainstreamed, but not in my neighborhood. And so once again, you had that tug of war. Yes, they should. No, they shouldn't. And I think what you see today is you see this bias that exists. And if you go to a television show that reinforces your belief. So if you're one side of the aisle, you go to the show or the channel that goes that way, and vice versa. That didn't exist back then. Today, you're celebrated for being fair, for giving two sides of a story. But back then, that was what we did. And if you didn't do that, you were fired. You were run out of the town. And so what was going on back then was that there was their transition at 60 Minutes after Don Hewitt left. And Don Hewitt left in about 2004, and it was taken over by Jeff Fager. And Fager took the program over, and it became a little bit more of a hard news program. It still was a terrific show, and Fager was a great journalist. But the show's storytellings started to change a little bit. And one of the stories that I did, my career path is very easy to understand. I was at 60 Minutes for 9 years, then became senior producer of Primetime Live in 2020 for 15, and then returned to 60 Minutes in 2004, where I spent more than 15 years. And the stories I did in my second tour of duty were different from the ones I did at my first tour of duty. And in the second tour of duty, I did profiles of John Gotti, and I did stories on Jack Abramoff, who was, of course, one of the great con men that's ever existed in Washington. But I also put myself in some danger. And when I returned to 60 Minutes, I wanted to, I felt like I still needed to prove myself. And I took a trip to Pakistan. And I had gotten to know the ambassador from Pakistan. And he said that he'll help me arrange a big interview with the head of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. And I jump on the plane, I go to Pakistan. And when I got there, the ISI, which is their CIA, said, no way, no how, we're not providing this guy to you. So what I decided to do was to try to find another Al-Qaeda guy. And by the way, these Al-Qaeda guys are not like pizza parlors in the Bronx. I mean, they don't grow on trees. There's like one or two of them. And so I went to the other guy who I knew, who was being protected in the big mosque in Islamabad, the Red Mosque. And it's a guy named Razi. And Razi spoke better English than I. He was educated in London and then ended up running Al-Qaeda in Islamabad. So I went to see him and talked to him, and he agreed to go on camera. So I do the interview with him on camera, and we're doing the interview in the mosque. And after we do the interview, we go, he shows me where in the madrasa the kids live, and we're in the back. And suddenly my CBS fixer starts yelling and screaming in Urdu, which I don't speak, of course. And they start yelling and screaming. And I don't know what's going on. And I just am smiling. And then he grabs me and pulls me out of the mosque and into the car. We sit down and I said, what just happened? And he said, they were talking about making another Daniel Pearl out of you. They were going to kidnap you. And I told them that my brother is the police chief in Kohat, a nearby town, and that if they touched you or did anything to you, he will track every member of their families down and slaughter them by sunrise. And that basically bought me a little time to get out of there. But, that's probably as close as I came, aside from it being a completely stupid thing for me to try, came as close I came to getting into some serious trouble. And people ask me, when I did interviews, other interviews, like when I did Gangsters, and I had done over the course of my career quite a number of mafia guys. And the last one that I did was a profile of John Gotti Jr. People said, were you scared with him? Believe me, it was nothing like Pakistan. Sitting in a restaurant in Syosset with Gotti surrounded by lawyers is nothing compared to the dangers I faced in Pakistan. But Gotti was a person who was not just going to agree to go on camera. I had to work him. And people say, well, do you call someone up and immediately they agree to go on camera? No. In the case of John Gotti, it took me 4 years to get him to agree to go on camera. And in the book, I talk about really some of the most extraordinary things I learned from him and from other gangsters at that time. But one of the things I learned from him was a trick that he did to keep alive. And what he did was he basically said at the end of each day, he grabs a cigar and he goes into the back porch and he thinks back to all the conversations he had that course of the day. When a person became a friend became an enemy. And those conversations were tip-offs to him. And he listened to his voice as he went through those conversations. And he said there's been more than one occasion he basically saved his life by realizing a friend had become an enemy, and he did something about it. People ask me also a lot, what have I learned from all the various people that I've met in the course of my career? And I've had the good fortune to really speak to some of the smartest people on the planet, some of the most successful people on the planet. And I think what I've learned the most is that it's important to fix what you broke. And what I mean by that is fix relationships, fix the planet, even fix house fixtures. Leave the place better than when you came. And don't hold grudges. It'll dominate your being. Let it go, move forward, and keep your good friends close. Shed bad relationships, friends that don't try to just have a million friends. I've seen that happen with various celebrities, and that doesn't work out. Keep the good friends close and spend as much time, especially like during the times we lived in with COVID, try to keep those relationships close to you. Try to talk to people that matter. And I think that really sums up really what it was like and some of the lessons I learned from some of the people that I've certainly spent time with. And thank you all for listening to me tonight. And I look forward to taking your questions. Gary?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. That is a lot to process. I'm still going over the Pakistan situation. So,
well,
right.
there's more deep, Gary. I gave the cliff note of the cliff notes tonight. I mean, the book has, by the way, a lot. And let me just say as well that with this book, if you buy it tonight, either through the bookstore or if you want to get it immediately through Amazon, you get a kugel recipe. And it's amazing. And you want to get it before Thanksgiving. Linda's going to be the keeper of the kugel recipe. And I'm sure she'll give it out. I've just met Linda, but I like her. And I know she's going to keep the kugel recipe only for those buying the book. Right, Linda? Yes, she says. Okay, Gary, it's yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you. First things first, thank you very much. I think I fair to say, speak for everyone. Absolutely fascinating. The three lucky raffle winners who will be getting a Kugel recipe and a compelling book to go along with it are Ed Rosen, Gwen
No
Rudnick.
relationship, no
That's right. Great. We would talk about this on a news show. And Gwen Rudnick and Raphael Chaikin, excuse me. So congratulations to you three. And as Mr. Ira Rosen pointed out, anyone who would like to purchase the book, Linda put her info in the chat box. So please check it out, and hopefully folks are able to do that quickly. So we have our first question. I'm just seeing it now, from one of our raffle winners, and no relation, Mr. Ed Rosen. What was Mike Wallace's relationship to his Jewish background? Seems it may have been problematic.
Thank you for asking that question. And that's a question certainly I've been asked on this road trip before. Mike Wallace was not a self-hating Jew. Let me get that out of the way. He told me he'd recite the Shema every night. Whether he did it every night or once a week, I don't know. But people thought he was sort of anti-Jewish because he did tough stories on Israel. He did an interview with Menachem Begin, and he asked Begin, what is the difference between the Menachem Begin, who was part of the Irgun, and Yasser Arafat? You both were freedom fighters at that time. And Begin, needless to say, did not appreciate the comparison. Mike also did something about the Temple Mount. And when the Israelis went on the Temple Mount and caused, a lot of sorrows, as we say, among us Yids. So, but he was just a tough journalist. He was fair to both sides. And he would also do really, really hard interviews with some of the top Arab leaders as well. And so I think that in today's world, when you put it through a sort of this filter, if they're not for you, they're against you. But that's not the way Wallace operated. He was just a fair guy, and he was an equal opportunity basher, if you will.
Okay, thank you. Rona Posner posed the question, how did you get along with the other reporters?
Oh, we were, well, you say producers were pitted against each other. We had rivalries. So I would go in and speak with Wallace, and he would say, God, you're not going to believe what, this producer just came up with. He's going to be doing an interview with Meyer Lansky. I said, oh my God. And then the other producer would come in and say, you're not going to believe what Ira Rosen just came up with. He's got an interview with, Joe Banana or something. And so he would pit the two of us against each other. They also tended to fire one or two producers every year. It's not uncommon, like Goldman Sachs fires the bottom 10% every year and kind of rehires people. 60 Minutes operated a little bit like that too. They would fire the bottom 10% of the producer staff every year. So it kept everyone on their toes and working hard. So we were competitors, and we worked, a lot of times we worked on the same stories, but we were working it for different correspondents. And so it pitted us against each other. Now, that's not to say that I didn't have friendships among the producers, but usually the friendships that I had were people who either didn't compete for the same stories I did or were working for a different correspondent.
Linda Pollock just asked, can you tell us a little bit about your father?
Thank you for asking that. My father was a Holocaust survivor, and he lived in a town called Ganzuka, which is on the border of Poland and Russia. And the Germans came into his town after the invasion of Poland, and they basically gave the people in the town 48 hours to do anything they wanted to the Jews. And in that 48 hours, you could imagine the pogrom that occurred. But my father was taken into the countryside and hidden by a Catholic family who hid him in the barn for 3 years. And the Catholic family risked their lives and their children's lives to protect my father. So in this very short moment in time, he saw the very worst of humanity and he saw the very best of humanity. And of course, the very best of humanity was how this Catholic family risked their lives to protect this young Jewish boy and hide him through the war. And my father always looked at life in an optimistic way because he remembered the family that hit him, not really the neighbors that killed his family. And I think I learned something from him in that regard, which is to be optimistic and always have a feeling that something will work out.
Thank you. Incredible. Joy Davidoff just pointed out, you were 26 and did not have a strong journalistic background. Why do you think they reached out to you to produce Mike Wallace?
So I didn't tell that part. It's in the book. It's in chapter 1. So the short version of it is I was working for a local TV station and I did an extraordinary story that Don Hewitt happened to have caught. And that's the way he operated. Don never operated by looking at a person's resume. He operated out of a sense of touch. And if he felt he liked you and he felt you were going to be a rock star, he would hire you. And he had seen the story I did, and the details are in the book, but needless to say, he was impressed.
Sure, absolutely. So one final question for me before we thank you and let you go. Did you always want to be a television producer? Was that something that you had kind of gone the entire way through school wanting to do, or is it something that you kind of fell into as you graduated?
Absolutely not. I was always going to be a newspaper reporter. I was working in newspapers for the Cornell Daily Sun. I worked in California. I worked in Ohio. I worked in Detroit. And I was between jobs in New York when I saw a little ad that somebody had not gotten a job in television. And my attitude was, how can I just basically write off this entire form of the media without at least trying it out? I had a kind of, at the time, a newspaper reporter's arrogance towards TV reporters. But I felt I couldn't just go my entire life with at least trying it on, and then I could go back to newspapers. And so I got the job at WOR TV, and the rest, as they say, is history.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, again, hopefully everyone, other than our 3 raffle winners, heads off to bug Linda Paula Kessler, to pick up a copy of the book right away.
By the way, I want to show everybody, this is, I'm kind of, a little older, but that's the way I looked with Mike Wallace at the time. This is about a year after he had hired me. Notice how he's looking up to me. That's why I use that picture in the back. Those pictures were few and far between. So
very nice. Thank you everyone for coming out this evening. Thank you very much, Mr. Ira Rosen, for the compelling talk and for writing this book for all of us to head off and get. And with that, hopefully we're able to meet again very soon and in person. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Gary. Be well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.